Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Alicia Cowart. I am currently a postdoc at the University of Colorado Boulder in the library, which is an odd position that I'll talk about in a minute. And that is not what this talk is about, though. So this talk is about a class I taught last year at UC Berkeley. But before I get to that, a few things about what I'm doing currently. So I am a fellow through a program called the Council on Library and Information Resources, and they actually have a postdoctoral fellowship program for folks who have a PhD in a particular area and are interested in working in libraries and providing resources to campuses through the library. So I'm the Geospatial Data Services postdoc at Boulder, and I am developing resources, doing workshops, a little bit of teaching, creating some curriculum for others to use, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I'm based out of the Center for Research Data and Digital Scholarship. So I'm now working across disciplines at Boulder, whereas previously, in my previous position, I was working as the cartography lecturer and staff cartographer in the Department of Geography at UC Berkeley. I did that for 4 years, and these are some examples of some student maps. These are all static maps, as you can see. And that is because the geography department at Berkeley has a long tradition of cartography, and the class is traditionally taught by lecturers, which is another thing that I'll talk more about later. So this was a lot of fun, teaching cartography for a few years and getting students to make some really incredible maps. But over time, I started thinking about how this could change. So I started building in more tools and thinking more about what are students interested in now. And so of course, with all the web mapping technologies we have now, students really want to make interactive maps. So I started adding in more lessons to my course, and finally I was like, well, I just need to build a new course. So that's what I'm going to talk about. But before I get to that, just a quick plug, another tradition from cartography at Berkeley is Guerrilla Cartography. So some of you are aware that Guerrilla Cartography is an organization dedicated to the expansion of the cartographic arts. I've given talks at past NACIS conferences about Guerrilla Cartography. Again, it's mostly all static maps. We recently had a one-day make an atlas in a day challenge, which was super interesting and fun. So you can go to the website guerrillacartography.org, check out all of that stuff. So without further ado, so the course I developed was called Geography 186 Web Cartography, and I used Ian Muhlenhaus's text by the same name, and it's actually a very good textbook. So if you're looking for a textbook for a web cartography class, I highly recommend it. He has written it in such a way that it does not get out of date, which is great. And it's also very well written, which is helpful when you're assigning reading to undergraduates. And I had that available as an ebook through the library, which was great. And I also used some articles from the Routledge Handbook of Mapping and Cartography, and some other articles here and there on various topics. This is just a very basic course outline. So the reason I wanted to do this course is I thought, well, I need to do a whole separate course on web mapping, because the process of making web maps and the things that we have to think about when we're making web maps is completely different, or slightly different, mostly different from making a static map. So I decided, and you know, the other thing is that of course I wanted to learn how to make web maps. So the best way to learn is to teach, right? So I thought, well, I'll just develop a course on web mapping. So I did get approval from the powers that be, and I wanted it to focus on cartographic design, and I wanted it to emphasize concepts rather than specific tools. I definitely didn't want it to be an advertisement for specific tools. And there were no prerequisites, which was the advice that I got from some student advisors who said, well, it'll be better for the students if you don't have any prerequisites for the class, and I'll talk more about why that might have been a mistake later on. So, some things I wanted to emphasize, of course, and some things that Ian emphasizes in his book, is that regardless of format, you're still having to think about how you're designing your map to communicate information. You have to make decisions as the cartographer, thinking about extent, aesthetics, classification, symbolization. All those things remain the same whether you're talking about a static map or a web map. And of course, we have to think about aesthetics, right? Because that aids in our visual communication. And I like to have these separate static versus interactive because you'll see in different places that they're defined very differently. But I consider a static map something that is just one view, and an interactive map something where the users actually can click or pan and zoom and things like that. So static maps usually made with desktop software, sometimes by hand. Interactive web map made with web tools, and that's very broadly defined. So platforms, command line tools, things like that, or a combination of desktop software and web tools. And then I also wanted to emphasize to students that there are reasons why we would use one or the other. And this is because a lot of times students want to make web maps because they're really cool and they're really interesting and they're interactive and fun. But sometimes it doesn't make sense. And I think that the static map is still very relevant. And I think also that it's important to think ahead of time which one you want to make, because you're going to go through a separate process depending on what you want to make. So thinking before you even start about whether you're making a static map or a web map, because that will define what tools you use as well as your whole process. Although we did see some cool presentations during Practical Cartography Day about how you can sort of meld those two things, which was very interesting. Anyway, so I gave students some examples of why you would use a static map over a web map and vice versa. One of the reasons I give the example of a web map when working data is that my first experience making web maps, I was an intern for the National Park Service, and it was kind of the early days of web maps, and we realized, oh, this is a whole different process. And what we were making was maps for planning purposes. So this was very much working data, not to be used for park visitors and things like that. So the tools I used in the class were mostly Mapbox and ArcGIS Online. And the reason behind that is that, of course, Mapbox allows you to customize a base map with vector tiles, which is great. Allows you to have a lot of control over the aesthetic of the map. And also because I had a former student who was a TA for the class who worked for Mapbox, so that was helpful. So she could call them when things broke and didn't work, and it was very helpful. And then, of course, we also used ArcGIS Online. It's definitely the most user-friendly web mapping tool in terms of just being able to point and click and get things done. And of course, we had a site license for the university. We did a little bit with Leaflet. We even did a little bit with Google My Maps, because that's a very simple way to just sort of put points on a map. So I'm going to sort of breeze through a few things, because I'm running out of time already, and just say a few things. So again, the tools that we used and why we used them and some of the pros and cons. And so what a lot of students ended up doing, and I let them use whatever tool they wanted to use, whether it was something we had already used in class or not. What a lot of students ended up doing was creating the base map in Mapbox and then importing that into ArcGIS Online to create their final layout, because ArcGIS Online allows for a lot more sort of final layout decisions, like really nice legends and apps and things like that. So that's what most people did. And I was actually going to demonstrate some of the web maps that my students made, but the internet connection in my hotel room was so slow that it was not working at all. So here's some screenshots of some of the maps that students made. And again, you know, the sort of limits of web tools plays into what they were really able to do. And so what I'm going to talk about next is some challenges with developing this course and some potential solutions. So there are two words that describe developing curriculum for what is basically a tech field, and that is time and consuming. And we all know that curriculum development is extremely time consuming anyway, because we already are gonna have to read things and assign reading and develop lectures and things like that. That's normal for any new course. But these last three, learning the new tools as the instructor, and then creating those exercises and labs for the students, and then being a resource for students when they're creating their projects, because I always have students do their own final projects. Those are the three things that become vastly more complicated when you're talking about web tools, because everything changes. We're all familiar with this problem, right? There's some folks here at this conference that have written some great stuff about this issue. So Carl Sack and Robert Roth have written some great articles in Cartographic Perspectives about the problem of teaching web mapping with tools that change constantly. And I've had a lot of conversations over the last few days as well about problems of tools that have taken away capabilities over time, or that have taken away accessibility and things like that. So it's really challenging to develop curriculum for an area that changes constantly, because you're going to have to change all your labs, all your materials, all your everything, learn new tools every time you teach it. So that's a huge challenge. So I think there's a real need for capabilities and accessibility for these tools to remain stable over time. And then the second challenge with the tools is that we have some nice GUIs with some of these web tools, but we're mostly stuck with Web Mercator. So there's issues, of course, we all know as cartographers that there are issues with using Web Mercator, especially for small-scale maps. You have limited creativity, and then, of course, there are contexts in which people are using these tools that they're not cartographers, they're not geographers, and they might not even know that that's a problem, right? Or that it could be misleading or causing people to communicate things in a sort of strange way. So one example is digital humanities projects where we're using mapping tools and creating maps, but maybe not thinking about what that map is actually communicating, because they're not generally talking about maps, right? And then, of course, command line tools are great, but there are significant barriers to entry, so it is very challenging and scary for a lot of students. Sometimes it's scary for the instructor too, to even start to work with this kind of stuff. So that's another big challenge. So some solutions I've been thinking about in terms of the first challenge, pedagogy and tech, is that there are resources beyond the single instructor. So we have folks in libraries. So again, that's what I'm doing now at Boulder, is I'm providing resources for both instructors and researchers. There are labs on campuses, geospatial labs, where there's people that can help with things like this. And then, of course, there's practitioners outside of academia. So I had some guest lectures in my course, people that I met through this conference, people like Alan McConkey and Stephanie May, who came and gave lectures in the course, which is great because it gives students a sense of what it's like to work outside of, beyond college as well. And then the last thing I will talk about in terms of solutions is I think we need to place emphasis on stable, user-friendly tools that are specifically for research and education, right? So how to do that, and I've been talking to a lot of computer scientists and folks in the info science department at Boulder, is talking with academics who are in that world, I think might be a helpful way to do this, because they understand the value of having things that are stable over time for teaching and for research. And then I think this last point was inspired by a talk I saw by Fernando Perez, who's the developer of Jupyter Hub. And he has been talking a lot about how we need to build upon existing tools versus new tech startups. So we don't need a new mapping technology, we just need to be able to build upon what we already have. So finally, were I to teach this again, what would I do differently? Well, I would have a prereq for one thing, and I think that prereq would actually be taking the other cartography course that I taught. So the print cartography course, so that I wouldn't have to rehash all those basic concepts, and we could just start from, let's talk about adding that interactivity into our maps. And lately I've been really excited to learn D3, so I'm gonna be working with that hopefully soon. And I probably would incorporate that into the course if I were to teach it again. But I won't be teaching it in the near future because I'm in a 2-year postdoc. So, and I will be teaching some grad courses coming up, but won't be specifically web mapping. So with that, I want to say thank you, and I definitely welcome your questions and feedback.